Welcome to It's All Mental, a podcast from Everyturn Mental Health. Mental isn't a bad word. There's no health without mental health. We're here to talk about every high and low, no limits, just good conversation. So welcome everyone to our latest podcast. My name is Sarah. I'm the Chief People Officer with Everyturn Mental Health, and I'm joined today by Lizzy, and we're going to be talking all about a really interesting topic, which is why it's okay to fail. Lizzy.
Hi, how's it going?
Good, thank you. Tell us a bit more about you.
So I'm one of the peer support workers for the Northumberland Recovery College, which is part of Everyturn. And kind of my role within that, I do a lot of psychoeducation. So I'm nearly a qualified counselor, so I do a lot of group work with people, wellbeing workshops where they learn about different topics, wellbeing subjects, what it is, what keeps it going, coping skills, ways that we might be able to manage it better. And I also do a lot of peer support groups, so bringing people together to discuss their own experiences and kind of facilitating that process for them.
Brilliant. And from all of that amazing work that you do came this really interesting topic, and thank you so much for volunteering to have a chat about it today. So why it's okay to fail. It is indeed okay to fail, and I think that's probably a sentence that doesn't necessarily sit comfortably with everyone. And certainly, you know, we were talking earlier, and from my own perspective, failure is something I do fear, and I do think quite a lot. So why do you think failure is an issue for people? That's a really broad question, but just to start thinking about it.
Yes, so a lot of people have difficulty allowing themselves to fail. And obviously, the variety of reasons behind that changes from different person to different person. We'll have a look at those, but I would say that mainly for most everybody, it comes down to our belief systems. It comes down to the way that we interpret failure and what we view about it. So most people that tend to have a lot of issues with failure and fear that failure and that process of learning and problem solving tend to be people that have quite negative beliefs about it. And they tend to revolve around kind of three subject areas. That the failure is going to be a really negative experience for yourself. And the second being that when that negative experience happens, that it's going to be catastrophic. And the third being that you then don't have the coping skills to be able to move past or manage that catastrophic negative failure that you've been through. So that tends to be a kind of a more overall, more universal way of looking at why people struggle with it. But of course, a huge thing is also fear of emotional discomfort. It's that idea that a lot of the time failure is associated with disappointment. It's associated with frustration, sometimes embarrassment if there are other people involved. And a lot of these emotions are really uncomfortable. And for some people that already struggle with uncomfortable emotions, it can also be pretty distressing. So we avoid these negative feelings. We don't even want to put ourselves in situations where there might be the possibility of failing. And one that you will also find quite often, especially within the workplace, is perfectionism. It's this sort of idea that we are either successes or we are failures, and we have this relentless pursuit of quite flawless expectations. And this really sets us up for a massive fear of failure. And the expectations we have tend to be unreasonably high. And anything short of that is unacceptable. So there is a lot more opportunity for failure almost than there is for us to actually be able to get to a point where we can be happy with the output of work or whatever we've tried to do. And this is one where we find ourselves paralyzed a lot of the time, just because we almost don't want to make a decision or don't want to move forward because we're afraid of getting it wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And I, you know, thinking about myself and many people I've worked with, that perfectionism and that, you know, having impossibly high standards for yourself is something that I've really been focused on and thinking about in recent years. How you know, if you're feeling in that situation, if this is ringing true with someone listening to this, how do they start really thinking about how they can take some steps to start dealing with this and moving forward with it, making some changes.
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to understand that fear of failure isn't necessarily a blanketed thing.
Yeah.
So, because we are fearful of maybe getting something wrong in a social situation, doesn't mean that we're fearful of all situations in our life when it comes to failure. So, it can be helpful to understand in what area of your life is failure a problem for you, because most likely it's not in every area of your life. So it could be, for instance, health, where, you know, sticking to a certain diet or being able to run a certain mile time is something that really kind of puts you in that uncomfortable state of fearing failure. It might be work, it might be expectations that you feel are on you from your family or from your friends. It might be relationship situations, but also really small things like daily responsibilities and tasks. So maybe spend a little bit of time reflecting and exploring what area is it that is causing the most problem for me? Where maybe am I really avoiding situations or finding it difficult to make a decision? So where am I paralyzed? Where do I feel as though I can't start for fear of getting it wrong? Once we start to understand that, we can be a lot more self-aware to what area it is. We can start looking at our beliefs and we can start to kind of challenge them a little bit. That takes a bit of time. Definitely something that you might want to look a bit more into. We probably can't get into it too much on the podcast. But if you're looking for just some kind of interesting hint, tips, and tricks, is the idea that failure is very much a precursor to innovation. So it's based on how we view failure. It's really interesting that we actually have to fail to learn. It's this idea of trying and seeing what works. You might have heard of an experiment that they do a lot of the time with corporates and business students and things like that, where they basically build what they call a marshmallow tower. So they give all these high-flying people sort of some dry pasta, some string, some tape, and a certain amount of time, and they have to build the tallest tower that they can in a limited amount of time that can then hold its structure with the marshmallow on top of it. And this has been done in lots of different team building situations. And as you might expect, the people that usually come out on top are architects, which I'm glad that's the case. But actually, out of all the rest of the people that they do it with, university students, business professionals, C-suite, schools, the people that actually then do the best and have the highest tower for the longest amount of time are really young kids. And the reasons behind that is this curiosity mindset, right? A lot of the time with students or with people that are already used to being in business, they spend a huge amount of their time planning. They spend a huge amount of their time shooting down ideas that maybe they think won't work, and maybe delegating tasks. And they only spend a very short amount of time at the end actually trying to put the tower together, which leaves very little opportunity for them to actually take whatever's gone wrong in the first iteration and apply it to the second in terms of that learning mindset and what they've taken from that failure. Young kids approach it with kind of a let's try as many things as possible and see what works mentality. And particularly in this situation, it really works well for them because they spend the entire time trying, pivoting, learning what went wrong the first time and then applying that to the second time. And that, I think, more than anything, really helps to demonstrate that power of failure, the ability to be able to use it as a teacher that offers you concrete lessons about what doesn't work and provides insights that what can be used later to refine your strategies or your approaches. And what has been shown through studies is that this sort of trial and error technique actually accelerates learning. And you actually have more of a, what I call a sticky mindset. So what you learn through trying and failing actually stays with you for longer in terms of understanding and what you've learned than if you did it right the first time. And a lot of the times when we do things right the first time, we also don't necessarily understand what we did to make it right. So that idea of being able to try things out and fail actually helps you in the long term develop that grit and resilience, but also cultivates that growth mindset and helps you to become more comfortable with the idea of failing.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I've got 2 children, and I'm thinking about, you know, absolutely thinking about this through how they would approach it. And that curiosity, like you say, we'll try, we'll get it wrong, but actually we'll bounce back really quickly and just move on to the next way of doing things. And I can see it hugely. When does that start to change? When does that kind of childhood curiosity mindset, when does that start to shift and feel a little bit different for people?
So I actually think, I mean, this is a much wider wider topic
Yeah.
here, but I do think that actually, because we have this kind of reward-based system on people that get things right, and if you're at school and you're performing at a higher level or you do really well at tests, yes, we want to be able to reward things that are great, but we also never help young people understand how to celebrate things that maybe didn't go right and really help them to reflect and have that introspection on what still did go right within a failing situation. So what we often do is we actually start at a very young age to almost push people into a perfectionist mindset and celebrate when they get things amazingly well and they seem to go 100% right. And then continue to have that expectation of the individual. What we don't do very much of is help people more with the emotional intelligence side of things and help them to really critically evaluate past situations that they might have deemed failures, but to really help them to understand what they got from it besides the fact that maybe it didn't go as they planned. So I think it really needs to start at a young age to help with that normalization of failure. The aspect of the fact that it's learning, it's growing. If anything, it gives you a great story, right? Some of the best stories I've heard having a pint at the pub or over dinner are stories of people that have just gone through the ringer in one way or another.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I would much rather listen to that than somebody who just sailed through life, right?
Yeah, always, always. So going back to, the area of your, exploring more about the areas of your life where perhaps that failure is an issue. How do people go about, if someone's thinking this rings true with me, but I've no idea where to start with exploring this? How do they go about doing it? And is it useful to bring in the views of other people, to talk about it with other people? What should people be looking to do to get this kind of started in their thinking?
Yeah, and I think that absolutely it's about talking it through. I think 9 times out of 10, when we get other people involved, it expands our viewpoint, it expands our perspective, and it helps us to see things in a more balanced way. Another thing is to look back at maybe a failure that you've been through and ask yourself, was the outcome that negative? And really hold yourself to account here. Don't just say, yes, it was uncomfortable, and therefore it was negative. Really kind of ask yourself, was this overarching just a negative situation, or was it all right? Maybe it wasn't positive and fantastic, but was it all right? Was it at least neutral for you? And then to ask yourself, was the outcome as catastrophic as you thought? Was it the worst case scenario, or maybe was it more of a hassle and a bit of a learning curve than an actual horror? And also then ask yourself, was I able to cope? Did I manage that situation? And you'll find that you probably did. Life kept moving. You woke up the next day, you persevered, you're still here. And on top of that, you've learned something through that situation. None of us would be where we are in life right now had we not been through the ups and downs of life and learned throughout the way. And that is exactly what I suppose failure is. It might even sometimes be good to find a better word than failure, because I
Yeah.
really don't see it as failure, right? It's an implication of growth.
Yeah, and that's just what I was thinking actually, we've called this session Why It's Okay to Fail. We're both using the words failure quite a bit, but actually is that the right word? Is that potentially quite unhelpful in thinking about these experiences?
Yeah, I think so, because it does kind of put things in quite a black and white sort of viewpoint. Because if there's a failure, then by kind of proxy, there has to be a success. And it doesn't leave a lot of room for the gray area.
Hmm.
Kind of gives us quite a rigid way of thinking with no real flexibility for us to be able to go in and really find maybe the other parts of that experience that isn't just success or failure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would assume everybody's perspective is really different. For some people, that fear of failure might be around kind of failing on the really big things in life, and for others, it might be about things that they deem to be smaller, more everyday. Does it vary with kind of how people view this?
Yeah, I think it does. I think a lot of the times, sometimes we don't even realize that we necessarily have an issue with failure, because some people, as again, you kind of think of those bigger overarching things that as a society we kind of view as success or failure. And a lot of people might say, well, that's not really something that I find issue with. But I think when you start putting it in other terms like perfectionism and your own standards that you hold yourself account to, but also if you start asking people, well, how are you with making decisions? Do you struggle with that? Do you find yourself procrastinating? Do you find yourself seeking
Mm,
reassurance from others constantly? Those are all kind of hints and red flags towards the fact that you might have some negative beliefs about failure. You might struggle a bit with failure. And ultimately, what you're struggling with is uncertainty, right? It's
yeah,
that not having a guarantee that things are going to be okay.
yeah, which can feel uncomfortable. And then
Yeah.
how does this link to well-being, to looking after your own well-being physically, mentally?
Yeah, well, I think ultimately it comes back to how we take the situations in life and reflect those back on ourselves. And a lot of us tend to internalize what happens as a reflection of who we are, whether we're good enough, and where we sit in the world and with others. I mean, I suppose as a personal example, I have been lucky enough to start up two businesses. One of them really well, able to sell that on, fantastic. One of them had to shut down, and I
Okay.
had to have those difficult conversations with staff that I really valued as well. And you see that very much as a big failure. And because the business failed, a lot of my self-worth was wrapped up in that. And
Mm,
so that business failure was my failure as a person, and not just as a boss, not just as a business lady or an entrepreneur. It was my failure as an overarching human being on this planet, to be able to maintain, see it coming, and be able to stop it from happening when it was happening, all of those type of things. And for a long time, I went through almost like a bit of a bereavement,
okay. Yeah.
and really kind of seeing that as a failure of my ability. And so it has a huge impact on your mental health and your well-being, because if you can't see the gray area, as we talked about, if you can't see, what you've learned from it and how you've changed as a person, and how the next time it happens, if it happens, you would reevaluate it differently, then it really can make you feel stuck. And obviously, it can also start avoidance, and you start
Mm,
to avoid situations in life because you don't want to go through that pain of failing, or that uncomfortable feeling of maybe not feeling as though you're living up to an expectation. And the more we avoid, this is where it gets really, really not scary, but it can start to really snowball fast. Because
yeah.
when we start to avoid challenges simply because we're afraid of failure, is when we start to limit our lives, and our worlds become really small, and we just stop interacting. And that's really where you can see that this starts to snowball into something more than just being afraid of failure.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that personal experience, because I've got a load of questions about that. On the point of avoidance, I think that is a really interesting one, and certainly something that I know I have found myself in previous situations of avoidance. How do you start to kind of recognize you might be in that situation, and what practical things can you start to do if this avoidance, like you say, is really snowballing?
Yeah, so again, I think avoidance is also about being really sort of upfront with yourself, really kind of
Mm,
looking back, spending that time going, what am I no longer participating in that I used to, that I enjoyed?
okay.
Am I finding that I am no longer, allowing myself to be in social situations, work situations, family situations where there's a possibility that it might be uncomfortable for me?
Mhm, mhm,
And a lot of this is kind of, and I suppose really what it comes down to is that unfortunately we then start to engage in safety behaviors. And what I mean by safety behaviors is things like you get invited to do a talk on something that maybe you've in the past been really passionate about, really enjoyed talking about, and you're finding that you're coming up with excuses not to go, or all of a sudden that niggling headache turns into, oh well, I think I might actually be really really sick, so I can't come.
mm,
And the thing behind safety behaviors is that they are motivated by fear a lot of the time, right? They're motivated by this feeling that we can't cope with this uncertain situation that's about to happen. And unfortunately, what happens is that avoidance gives us relief in the short term,
mm,
right? It helps us to go, oh, good, I avoided that situation. I don't feel as anxious now. I can breathe knowing that I don't have to do that. And so we do get that short term relief that can be kind of intoxicating at the beginning. Unfortunately, over time, not only does that relief start to dwindle, it also means that we are never allowing ourselves to really look at how we might approach this for more of a long term solution.
yes.
And the more we avoid, the harder it is for us to then get back into the things that we want to participate in. So it's really about starting small more than anything. So
Hmm.
if you find yourself in a position where you feel as though your world's gotten smaller because you've been afraid of doing things, being a part of things that might lead to failure, then it's about what are the smallest things you can do. Make a list. What are the things that you're not
Mm,
doing that you used to enjoy doing? What's the easiest thing you can do that leads you to the least amount of anxiety? And just start small. And this is what you call behavioral activation. So what you'll find is the more that you engage in things and you find out that it's okay, you learn that it's going to be all right, and maybe you even enjoyed it, the more motivation you have to keep doing that. And ultimately, hopefully, sort of spiraling you back up to where you were
yeah.
before.
Yeah, I think those small practical steps will be really, really beneficial for people to hear about, and to understand about the things that they can start thinking about, because it's like you say, that avoidance snowballing, I'd imagine, is a really, really common situation. Just before we finish up, I'm really interested in the personal experiences you shared, and looking back at the example of your business, and that didn't work out. What do you take from that now, and how has that changed how you are and how you think about learnings and failure?
I think it really was helpful in the development of my grit and resilience. So it
Okay.
was obviously a long term, well, for me at least, the business shutting down from like kind of realizing it might happen and then kind of going through the process. It wasn't short. It wasn't a quick failure. It was a pretty slow,
Mm,
drawn out failure. And so there was definitely a grit and resilience that I had to maintain during that time. And I certainly feel as though am much better equipped to handle future challenges, but also what I've learned in terms of what I would do differently if I was in that situation again.
Mm.
I've learned more about what helps me cope. So during
Okay.
that time, I found myself in the garden a lot.
Nice. Nice.
And I know that that is something that really helps me to ground and to kind of get my head away from all the thoughts and just allows me to do something with my hands. So, in terms of understanding what I can do to help calm myself during those times, but also I would say that it's really improved my decision making,
Okay.
helping me to know what went wrong, but also where my abilities sort of begin and end is a big one as well.
Hmm.
And being able to kind of understand, what are my strengths and weaknesses and accept those and maybe
Yeah.
work on the weaknesses, but also really be more confident in the strengths that I hold.
Which is absolutely amazing. And when you frame it like that, there's just so many positives that you can take from that, but in terms of what happened, but also how you can apply that to working with other people.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the other thing is, whatever you think is a failure, 99 times out of 100 is not what other people
Yeah.
view as a failure, right? We are our own worst enemies at
We are,
times. We
we
can
are,
be the harshest critics to
we can.
ourselves. And realistically, people are not going to be sitting there waiting for you to trip up. And when you do, they're not going to be criticizing you for doing that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think if anything, they would just be more disappointed if you didn't take anything from that
Yeah.
experience.
I completely agree. I completely agree. That's that's absolutely right. People are not there waiting for you to fail and say, "I told you so," or "You should have done it differently." It's not like that. And I really hope that this podcast helps to open that conversation up for people. And I really liked thinking about failure in the context of innovation and learning, because actually, whether it's in work, outside of work, whatever it might be, innovation and learning are hugely positive and a really important part of people's lives. So framing failure from that angle, I think, is really, really fascinating. And before we finish, is there anywhere, any signposting or anything that you would point people in the direction of if they're interested in more on this subject?
Well, I mean, they're always welcome to have a look at what we do at the Recovery College. Anybody that lives or works in Northumberland is welcome to sign up, and you get access to more than just psychoeducation and kind of workshops and things. We do a lot of groups, a lot of meetups, and it's all completely free. There are some great researchers out there that
Okay.
have a lot to do with this kind of area. So let's see, one of them is a lady called Carol Dweck. It's Dweck. She talks a lot about fixed mindset versus growth mindset, and that
Yes.
plays a really
Yes.
significant role in sort of the perception of
Hmm.
failure. And let's see, there's one other that I wanted to bring up. We also have Angela Duckworth. So she talks a lot on grit and perseverance, which again goes straight into failure. And finally, Dr. Christian Neff, she does a lot of research into self-compassion, and again, really ties in quite tightly to failure and kind of how hard we are on ourselves, but also how self-compassion can actually motivate us to continue moving through periods of hard times.
Yeah, self-compassion, absolutely. And I think that's a really interesting topic to link this to, and something that I know I've done a lot of reading on and feels really, really important. Thank you so much, Lizzy. We could chat about this all day, and I'm really, really grateful that you've given up your time to take part in this podcast today. So a huge thank you very much for all of your amazing advice and signposting as well. It's hugely appreciated. Thank
Well,
you.
thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to It's All Mental, a podcast from Everyturn Mental Health. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to follow, rate and share, and see you next time.